So let us go to the word of the Lord. I want to reread a couple of verses from chapter 3 and then continue in chapter 4. The word of the Lord is as follows. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. The 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Going down further, dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality, so they would be ready for that day. Continuing in chapter 4. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain it to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches in the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all Esther's instructions. Thus far, the word of the Lord. You may be seated. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. The customs are different from those of all other people. They do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators. So the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, the king said to Haman, and do with the people as you pleased. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. I want to preach today from the subject, we overcome false narratives. We overcome false narratives. In the movie and Broadway musical Wicked, one of the most powerful subplots is how the wizard uses false narratives to create imaginary enemies to stoke fear among the citizenry and therefore to consolidate his power. These false narratives that heighten unrealistic fear set the psychological distancing in the minds of the people of Oz that justifies the mistreatment and oppression of the subjects of the false narratives. It is first seen in what happens with the animals, and then it is later seen in what happens with Elphaba. History is replete with instances of false narratives leading to fear, discrimination, and the mistreatment of individuals and groups. In the Spanish Inquisition, false narratives were spread about Jews who had converted to Christianity, secretly practicing Judaism, which led to the persecution, imprisonment, and execution of many innocent people. In Massachusetts, there was the Salem witch trials, where many, primarily women, were imprisoned and executed under the suspicion that they were practicing witchcraft. In the immediate wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor, false narratives about Japanese Americans being disloyal led to over 120,000 Japanese Americans being placed in concentration camps during World War II. In Germany, Nazis spread the false narratives of Aryan superiority and blamed Jews for Germany's economic and social problems. In Rwanda, there was the false narrative that the Tutsis, a minority tribe in Rwanda, was responsible for the grievances of the Hutu majority, which resulted in the genocide of 800,000 Tutsis and sympathetic Hutus within 100 days. Sadly, such practices are not limited to the pages of history. We find it happening in our current time during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is ironic that this is the 5th year anniversary of the nation being shut down. 5 years ago on this day, we were shut down due to COVID, and during that period, false narratives were spread about the virus, its treatment, and vaccines, which resulted in fear and stigma and even violence against Asians. During the 2024 election, false narratives were spread about Haitian immigrants eating dogs and cats. Much of the cyberbullying that occurs right now is due to the false narratives and rumors on social media, which leads to harassment, canceling, and ostracism. The firing of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, is another example. Our current president's war against DEI has set the environment where any free-thinking, independent black person holding any position of authority is seen as a threat and is termed a DEI hire. This is a smokescreen to hide the true objective. Using words such as meritocracy assumes that people of color are not people of merit. For generations, people of color with higher qualifications have been used to train lesser qualified whites and watch positions that they married be given to less qualified white males usually. And so whenever you hear the word now being used, meritocracy, used by persons in the current administration and its party, it's a code word for white males. Lying underneath all of this is the far right's great replacement conspiracy theory, which posits that the increase of racial, ethnic, and religious minority populations is a concerted effort to displace Christian white Americans. This false narrative is what is fueling many of the actions that are going on in Washington right now. A survey reported out by the Southern Poverty Law Center in April of 2022 showed that 2/3 of Republicans agree with a core tenet of the Great Replacement theory, being Democrats intentionally importing immigrants to replace conservative white voters. It has stimulated violent responses, including mass murders in Buffalo, New York, at the Tops Friendly supermarket, where a white individual went to where he thought black people were going to be and then shot up the place. And New Zealand at the Christchurch Mosque, in El Paso at a Walmart, in Pittsburgh at the Tree of Life Synagogue, all because of false narratives being spread about people of racial and ethnic background, stirring up fear and generating hostility and violence. The church should be heard saying, we reject false narratives. We condemn false narratives. And we overcome false narratives. This is what is playing itself out within the course of our text. The setting of the book of Esther is during the exile period where Israel is under the domination of the Persians. The marital dysfunction of the king of Persia sets the stage for a young Jewess named Esther to enter the realm of the palace, eventually becoming queen. Under the tutelage of her uncle Mordecai, she keeps her Jewish identity to herself because she could pass as a Persian. Mordecai was also a man of high integrity whose actions saved the king from death. And it is against this backdrop that we are introduced to a high-ranking Persian official by the name of Haman, whose personal animus towards Mordecai, due to an irrationally perceived slight, prompts him to create a false narrative against Mordecai's people with the aim of their extermination. His personal animus towards Mordecai morphs into an animus against Mordecai's people. He says, why should I just destroy Mordecai when I can destroy Mordecai's people? And so he creates a narrative about Mordecai's people. He goes to King Xerxes saying, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdoms. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. Not discerning Haman's true motivation and intention, and looking at the offer of $10,000 to be able to take them out, the king commands his scribes to prepare an edict, an executive order for the destruction of all Jews within his realm. The people of God have survived much. They've endured being taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar, kept in exile by Belshazzar, inherited in exile by the Medes and the Persians. And while those were restrictive experiences, they were not the existential threat of extermination. This was a whole different level of threat. And it exists because of a false narrative. The fact that this is contained within the larger narrative of God's work within the line of Judah and the seed of Abraham, it reveals that God's purposes for a person or people are often met with extreme challenge. The carrying out, the furtherance of God's purpose in the world does not occur within perfect and pristine settings. It often occurs within the harrowing and the horrific. It is confronted by inequity and injustice and unfairness and hardship. And therefore, we find through the reading of Scripture, through God dealing with God's people, even in this circumstance, that we are able to resist and overcome false narratives and their effects by holding firmly to God, actively and intently pursuing His purpose, and that being the larger and truer narrative. The fact that God is working in the midst of jacked up situations, that's a narrative you got to hold on to. That when you are facing challenge and trouble and trials, you got to know that there is this narrative that God is working in the midst of it. That's what allows you to say, and we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him and are the called according to His purpose. God is working. Can somebody just say, God is working? This is subtly but profoundly asserted in that the name of God does not show up in the whole book of Esther. There's no mention of God, no mention of Yahweh, no mention of Elohim. Not one of the names of God shows up in the book of Esther in its writing. The overt telling of God and his narrative is strangely absent. It's not on the page. In the midst of Haman asserting a false narrative that threatens to destroy God's people and thus destroy God's purpose in the world, the name of God is strangely absent. And yet God is very much in the story. I raise this for us because some may wonder, where's God in all that is happening right now? Where is God in the midst of the madness that is going on right now? How can all of this go on with God being God? How can much needed food to prevent starvation and drugs to prevent mass deaths of women and children sit rotting on the docks? How can funds necessary for the elderly to survive be held up or denied? How can God be God in the midst of all this that is happening? And what Esther and the people's story tells us is that God is still doing his thing. With people and God is still doing his thing, because God activates the conscience and courage of people in strategic positions. Look at the story. With Haman reveling in the king having issued his edict, the scene shifts to Mordecai absorbing the horror and demonstrating his grief. The first 3 verses of chapter 4 read, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews. The king's executive orders created an existential crisis for Mordecai and his people that first had to be absorbed. Mordecai and his people, the threats to the existence of their person had to be absorbed. The threats of existence has to be grieved. It is in the absorbing that you come to understand it and your place in it. Mordecai is one among them. This edict affects him. He's not exempt from it. While he's a palace officer, he's not immune to it. The edict against the people was an edict against him. And what was told to the king about the people is what was said about him. He was a victim of the false narrative, just like everybody else. And that's something for us to underscore, because there are some who may feel that because of certain factors, they are immune to what is currently taking place. Can I burst your bubble? The psychological seeding that is taking place around race and ethnicity is a threat to every person of those races and those ethnicities. There is nothing that protects you or your children from the potential harm. Your zip code does not protect you. Your socioeconomic status does not protect you. Your political affiliation does not protect you. The very people who put the current administration in office are some of the very ones suffering under the weight of what is happening right now. And some of them had the misguided notion that he was talking about everybody else but them. No, boo, you too. You're the subject of the false narrative. You're the subject of the false assumptions. You're the subject to the irrational fears. You're a candidate just like everybody else. Mordecai feels it just like everybody else. And he does not hide his feeling. It's something that Esther would soon learn for herself. Esther becomes aware something's going on with Mordecai. He's out there crying, grieving, sackcloth and ashes. And so Esther says, we need to find out what's going on. Because Esther right now, she's in the palace. She doesn't know what's going on. She hadn't heard about it. So she sends Hathach to see what's going on with Mordecai. Mordecai tells him the whole story, including the money that Haman promised to pay into the royal treasury for the Jews to be destroyed. Haman understood that the king was a deal maker, a man of transactions. So he offers him a transactional arrangement, the art of the deal. A deal was made for the destruction of their people, predicated on a lie about them, which sprung from Haman's personal animus. And Mordecai sent Hathach back with a copy of the decree for Esther to see for herself, along with the request that she go to the king and intercede on behalf of her people. Well, Esther responds, now Mordecai, now you know what the law is. You know nobody can go to the king unless they are invited. And I ain't been called for 30 days. And you know how the king gets, and you know how his temper is, and you know what happened to Vashti for asserting herself, so I can't go brand new on the king. Mordecai cuts to the chase by telling her, now don't think that your spot in the palace protects you from this edict. If they are killed, so will she be killed. And if she keeps quiet at a time like this, deliverance will come from some other place. But she and her relatives, they will die. And then Mordecai puts this on her. Perhaps you're there for such a time as this. Maybe this explains how you, being the least likely candidate, would get the position. Maybe this explains how you got the favor of Haggai, who knew the king best and hooked you up with the best treatments. Maybe this explains why the usual palace intrigue has not fazed you. Please know, somebody, wherever you are is far more than for you being where you are. You are not just there to be there. You are there for a purpose beyond your arrival and your attainment. There is a God purpose that is redemptive in nature. And sometimes the redemptive purpose that God has for you being where you are emerges in a time of conflict. It emerges in a time of trial. It emerges in a time that may require sacrifice. You are there for such a time as that. Mordecai seeks to quicken Esther's conscience and call for courage. He challenges her to discern the meaning of the moment and her place within it. He seeks to elicit the recognition that any future moments that she has may rest on what she does with this moment right now. There may not be any future moments if she fails to rise to the occasion in this moment. Participation in God's larger and truer narrative, especially in the face of false narratives, requires the activation of conscience and courage. It's recognizing the personal place and stake that each of us has. It's being attuned to the fate of future moments, resting on decisions that we make in current moments. Such attunement should cause certain questions to be raised in the current moment. What future do I actually want? What do I want for my children, grandchildren? What physical, social, and psychological environment do I want them to inherit and inhabit? What threats do I not want for them? What disappointments do I not want for them? What burdens do I not want for them? What obstacles do I not want for them? How does what I choose, how does what I support, how does what I confront help assure future moments that I want for me and that I want for mine? Because please understand, your future moments ride on what you do with today moments. Your next moments are set up by your now moment choices. The narrative that you want for your future relies on what you write in your actions today. If you want your future to read a certain way, then there are certain decisions you need to be making right now in order for that future to read the way that you desire. It just ain't gonna magically happen. No, what you do today sets up what is possible for you tomorrow. Esther comes to terms with this. She says, all right, here's what I want you to do. I want you and everybody else join me in a fast for 3 days so that I can prepare for what I must do. Hers would be an act of civil disobedience. She would approach the king uninvited. Having counted the cost of her silence, she determines the price of her exercising her voice to be worth it. If she and her people were to have a future, she'd have to risk the present. Overcoming false narratives, participating in God's larger and truer narrative will require risking the present for the sake of the future. It's risking present comfort, present status, present for what you want in the future. If you want a future of stability and freedom and liberty and for future generations, there's some risks that have to be taken right now. And the taking of those risks is not natural. Why? Because nature seeks self-preservation. Nature seeks protection. Nature seeks comfort. Nature seeks security. But what she's about to do is going to entail transparency and vulnerability. She's now going to reveal what she kept hidden. She's getting ready to color outside of the lines by visiting the king uninvited. She'd be taking a corrupt palace power. She's taking it on, and such risks call for something that is more than what is natural. That's why Esther says, I need y'all to fast. I need y'all to pray, because she knows that this is more than flesh and blood. This is spiritual. And while it's being played out on the level of the flesh, it is ultimately a matter of the spirit. This is about the continued unfolding of God's purpose in the world. And for that reason, spiritual power has to be sought. I believe somebody knows something about seeking spiritual power. You recognize what you were up against, and you recognize that you were up against more than what was natural, and that what was on the line was more than superficial and short term. You discovered and discerned that this is more than flesh and blood. And there's something more going on than underneath the surface. There's more on the line. There's more that's at stake. And for what was on the line and for what was at stake, you needed more than what your flesh and blood could bring. You needed some real power. You needed God's power. You needed God to exert himself on your behalf. You needed his power to overcome your fear and to overcome your anxiety and overcome your worry and overcome your sense of insufficiency and inadequacy. You needed God to give you what you needed, what to do and when to do and how to do and where to do and with whom to do. You needed God to work where you were not, and you needed God to reach where you could not reach. Am I talking to anybody? Anybody here right now because you need some spiritual power from God? You need his power to live. You need his power to serve. I need his power to preach, to stand. As a father, I need his power. As a husband, I need his power. As a son, I need his power. I need him every hour. Who am I talking to right now who can say, I need the Lord right now? Esther said, I'm going to need some spiritual power to take this on. And I need to help somebody understand, if you think you're going to survive what we are undergoing right now simply because you got a degree and you got an office, let me tell you something, the devil has you fooled. We're wrestling not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, the rulers of the darkness of this world, spiritual wickedness in high places. You need more than your office. You need more than your business card. You need some real power. You need more than a connection talking with somebody who knows somebody. You need to know God for yourself so that you can say, Father, I stretch my hand. Real power. Real power. Esther says, I'm going to need some real power. And with the end of chapter 4, question is raised. Is Haman's false narratives going to succeed? Will the people of God be taken out by a false narrative? Chapters 5 and 10 give us the answer. And here it is. When it is God's narrative on the line, then it's on the God who wrote the narrative to work to fulfill the narrative. When it's God's narrative that's on the line, then it's on God who wrote the narrative to work to fulfill the narrative. With Haman seeking to destroy God's people through a false narrative, God's got to work to fulfill the narrative that God has written. Because this isn't simply an act against Mordecai, Esther, and the people. This is an act against God and what God had purposed for his people and for the world through his people. Though God's name is not mentioned, this is contained in the unfolding narrative that begins in Genesis and will conclude in Revelation. God works to fulfill what God proposes and plans. God works what he wills. He works what he writes. God works by giving Esther a plan to engage Xerxes, with Haman building a gallows to hang Mordecai. God works his narrative by revealing the truth of Mordecai's heroism to the king against the lies that Haman would speak about Mordecai and his people. God speaks and shows the truth to the king about Mordecai, causing the king to decide, I want to honor Mordecai. And here's how God works it out. When the king makes the decision to order Mordecai based upon the truth that the king learns about Mordecai, guess who the king calls in to lead in having to honor Mordecai? He calls in Haman. And he says, Haman, what do you do for somebody that you want to honor? And Haman thinks that the king is talking about him. And so Haman gives this long list of things that should be done. And the king says, good, that's what I want you to do for my man Mordecai. And when the king does that, God works the truth of these words. Thou prepares a table before me in the presence of my enemies. God works the truth of his narrative by giving Esther the right words at the right time for Xerxes to not only hear Esther's truth, but then to recognize Haman's crookedness. God works the narrative that he wrote. God works his narrative so well that the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai was the gallows upon which Haman is actually hung. And when God did that, God worked the truth of those words. No weapon that's formed against you shall be able to prosper. God works the narrative such that the king revokes the orders that he had issued, which were devised by Haman to annihilate the Jews. And then God gave the Jews authority to destroy those that would assault him. God works his narrative such that on the day that the enemies had hoped to overpower them, the very opposite had occurred. And when God did that, God worked the truth of the narrative. When the wicked, even mine enemies and my foes, come upon me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and they fell. Against the aims of the false narrative, God works his true narrative. His narrative is one about a lamb slain from the foundation of the world, with Satan using a false narrative, duping Adam and Eve in the garden. God announces another narrative of the seed of the woman bruising the head of the seed of the serpent. God works his narrative when Joseph's brothers use a false narrative of a wild beast destroying Joseph to cover up their having sold Joseph out. God worked his narrative of Joseph ascending, causing Joseph to later say, what you did, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to save those who are alive. God worked his narrative with Pharaoh acting on the false narrative of the Hebrews joining Egypt's enemies. God worked his narrative of making them into a great nation and leading them out with their heads held high. God works his narrative because from the seed of the woman has to come the one who's going to bruise the head of the seed of the serpent. And therefore his people have to survive. They have to survive through Egyptian bondage, Assyrian and Babylonian captivity, Persian, Greek, and Roman domination. God worked his narrative so that Jesus, born against a false narrative concerning his birth, God worked his narrative that a virgin would conceive and bear a child against the mendacity of a small-minded king named Herod, sending Mary and Joseph and Jesus into Egypt as refugees. God says, I'm going to fulfill my narrative. Out of Egypt I've called my son. God worked his narrative in Jesus against the false narratives of the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes. He worked his narrative, overcoming the bloodlust of a manipulated mob that cried, crucify him. God worked his narrative such that the cross on which they hanged Jesus, designed to be the emblem of suffering and shame, that became the place where mercy was great and grace was free. God worked that narrative such that the place where Jesus was lifted up would be the place where God would draw all people unto himself. God worked his narrative so that the cross where darkness fell between the 6th and the 9th hour would be the very place where you would say, at the cross, where I first saw the light and the burdens of my heart rolled away. God worked his narrative so that Friday that was meant to be bad would become Friday that we call good. For there the narrative is, he was wounded for my transgressions, he was bruised for my iniquity, the chastisement of my peace was upon him, and with his stripes I am healed. God worked his narrative so that love would conquer hate, and truth would conquer falsehood, and light would conquer darkness, and life would conquer death. Because you do know that God's narrative is that Jesus died on Friday, they buried him Friday, he stayed there Friday night, he stayed there all day Saturday. The narrative says he stayed there all night Saturday, but early Sunday morning God raised Jesus from the dead with all power in his hand. And here it is, for 1992 years that narrative has been true. It's overcome kings and kingdoms, it's overcome emperors and empires, it's overcome dictators and authoritarians. I don't know about you, but I'm thankful that I got that narrative for myself. I'm thankful that one day I accepted Jesus as my Lord and Savior, and I entered into the narrative of salvation. I'm included in his narrative. No false narrative that's imposed upon me can stop God's true narrative concerning me. Am I talking to anybody in here? Is there anybody happy about the truth of his narrative? Can anybody say, I'm saved by his truth, I'm redeemed by his truth, I'm secured by his truth, I'm comforted by his truth, I'm in that narrative? Here it is, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. I'm an heir of salvation, I'm purchased of God, I'm born of his spirit, I'm washed in his blood. This is my story, this is my song. I'm praising my Savior all the day long. Is there anybody here who can say he overcame the false narratives in my life, who I wouldn't be, what I never accomplish, what I never get, where I never go? Is there anybody here who can say he overcame every false narrative that anybody put on you? And he said, let me talk to you about the real narrative that you are. You are the apple of my eye. You are greater is he that is in you than he that's in the world. Let me give you the the true narrative. My God, you are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a chosen generation. You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. You are more than a conqueror. Anybody grabbing a hold of the true narrative, I'm blessed. I'm highly favored of God. I'm loved by the Lord. The Lord has a plan for my life. It does not yet appear what I shall be, but I know that when he shall appear, I shall be like him, for I'll see him just as he is. Thank God that I'm included in that narrative that makes its way all the way to the book of the Revelation, when it tells me that he's coming back for me, and I'm going to be with him, and there will be no more crying, no more dying, no more sickness, no more pain, no more death, for the former things have been passed away, and God shall wipe all tears from my eyes. Yeah! Yeah!